For over 50 years, fans have watched the Robinson family crash land on an alien planet, unaware of a hidden truth buried behind the scenes. The cast of Lost in Space kept a secret so shocking that it completely changes how you'll watch the show. One actor refused to return for the final season. Another struggled with addiction on set. The robot that became the heart of the series almost never existed. And there's a behind-the-scenes rivalry that nearly destroyed the entire production. But the biggest revelation? The real reason the show ended, and what the network didn't want you to know. What really happened during those 3 seasons that made the cast speak out, decades later. When Lost in Space first aired in 1965, nobody predicted that a mechanical character would become the emotional core of the entire series. The robot wasn't even supposed to be there. The original pilot episode was filmed without him. But when network executives saw the early footage, something felt missing. There was no heart, no anchor. The family felt alone in a way that made viewers uncomfortable. So the producers scrambled. They needed something or someone that could bridge the gap between danger and hope. They needed the robot. What fans never knew was how close they came to never seeing this character at all. The special effects team at the time was skeptical. Robots were expensive to build. They were clunky. They broke down constantly during filming. The technology wasn't reliable. One producer actually argued that the robot would make the show look cheap and dated. He wanted to scrap the entire idea. But Bob Kinoshita, the brilliant costume designer who created the robot, fought for it. He believed in the vision. He knew that audiences didn't need a perfect machine. They needed a character. The robot's suit weighed over 200 pounds. Think about that for a second. An actor inside that thing, moving around in extreme heat on set, couldn't see properly, could barely breathe. The performer who eventually became the robot had to endure hours of physical torture just to film a few minutes of footage. His name was Bob May, and he was a skilled stuntman who understood the assignment. But even he didn't realize the toll it would take on his body. By the middle of the first season, he was experiencing chronic pain. His back ached constantly. His vision problems from inside the suit were getting worse. The network knew about this. The producers knew. Nobody said anything to the public. What made it even worse was that Bob May never received proper credit. His face was never shown. His voice wasn't even his own. It was dubbed over by Dick Tufeld in post-production. So Bob May did the hardest physical work on set, suffered through the most intense conditions, and the world never knew his name. For years, decades even, fans loved the robot. They wrote letters to the studio about the robot. They wanted merchandise of the robot. But nobody was sending love letters to Bob May because nobody knew he existed. The tragedy is that this sacrifice, this incredible physical commitment, is what made the robot feel so real to audiences. The character moved in a way that felt genuine because Bob May was genuinely struggling inside that suit. His pain became the robot's vulnerability. Viewers could sense it even if they didn't know why. That authenticity changed everything. It made the robot more than just a special effect. It made him a character worth caring about. But here's what the cast revealed years later that nobody expected. Bob May wasn't the only one suffering behind the scenes. The physical and emotional toll of making this show was about to get much worse. By the end of the second season of Lost in Space, tensions on set had become unbearable. The show was a massive hit. Ratings were climbing. The network wanted to keep going. But not everyone was excited about a third season. One of the show's most beloved cast members made a shocking decision. He would not be coming back. His name was Goddard, and he played Major Don West, the confident, resourceful pilot of the Jupiter 2. He was the action hero, the romantic interest, the guy who always had a plan. But behind the scenes, Goddard was drowning. The reason he refused to return wasn't about money. It wasn't about ego or contract disputes. It was something much more personal. Goddard was struggling with the relentless pace of television production in the 1960s. They were filming constantly. There was no break between seasons. Scripts were being written while scenes were being shot. Actors had to memorize pages of dialogue overnight. The pressure never stopped. For someone trying to give their best performance, trying to bring authenticity to every scene, It was crushing. Mark Goddard reached a breaking point. He told producers he was done. He needed out. What made this decision even more dramatic was the timing. The network had already announced that there would be a third season. The marketing was in motion. Promotional materials were being printed with his face on them. And then, suddenly, the producers had to figure out how to continue without their leading man. They couldn't just replace him. Fans would notice immediately. So what did they do? They got creative. They decided to shift the focus of the show. Don West would still appear in the series, but Mark Goddard's involvement would be reduced. He would film fewer scenes. He would be sidelined more often. But here's where it gets interesting. After Mark Goddard left, he didn't disappear quietly. Years later, when interviews started circulating, he opened up about what had really happened. He revealed that staying on the show any longer would have destroyed his mental health. He talked about the exhaustion, the anxiety, the feeling of being trapped in a machine that didn't care about his well-being. He wasn't the only cast member feeling this way. Others were suffering too. But Mark Goddard had the courage to walk away when it mattered most. The cast eventually revealed that the network's response to his departure was cold and calculated. They didn't try to convince him to stay. They didn't offer him time off or reduced hours. Instead, they simply adjusted their plans and moved forward. It was business, nothing personal. But to Mark Goddard, it felt like a betrayal. He had given everything to make this show work. And when he needed support, the machine just rolled on without him. What the producers didn't anticipate was how his absence would affect the dynamic on set. Without Mark Goddard's presence, something shifted. The energy changed. And it wasn't just about losing a talented actor. It was about losing someone who had been fighting to keep the show grounded and real. The third season would feel different. Lighter, less grounded, more focused on camp and comedy. Some fans loved it. Others felt like something important had been lost. And now you know why. But Mark Goddard's departure wasn't the only crisis brewing behind the scenes. This is the section where the story gets darker. For decades, the cast of Lost in Space kept quiet about something that was happening on set during the show's run. One of the principal actors was battling a serious addiction. The network knew. The producers knew. The cast knew. But nobody talked about it publicly. Not in interviews. Not in behind-the-scenes documentaries. Not even in memoirs. It was a secret locked away, protected by the code of Hollywood in the 1960s. A time when mental health struggles and addiction were treated as shameful secrets rather than human problems that needed compassion and treatment. The actor in question had access to prescription pills. Painkillers mostly, but also sedatives and other medications that were handed out far too freely during that era. There were no real regulations. No oversight. A doctor would prescribe something, and suddenly you had a cabinet full of pills that could spiral into dependency. The long hours on set made it worse. The pressure made it worse. The isolation made it worse. Pretty soon, the actor was relying on these pills to get through each day, to calm the anxiety, to numb the exhaustion, to cope with the weight of being on a hit television show. What made this situation uniquely dangerous was the nature of the work. This actor had scenes that required physical performance, action sequences, emotional moments that demanded presence and authenticity. But addiction doesn't care about your schedule. It doesn't care that you're in the middle of filming a scene. It doesn't care that thousands of people are depending on you. It just gets worse. And gradually, other cast members started noticing. The performance quality was slipping. There were moments of confusion on set. Lines were being forgotten or stumbled through. Some days were better than others, but the pattern was undeniable. The producers faced an impossible choice. They couldn't fire the actor, he was essential to the show. They couldn't stop production, the network would never allow it. So what did they do? They enabled the situation. They looked the other way. They brought in people to help cover for the actor during scenes where his condition was most obvious. They adjusted shooting schedules to work around his worst days. In some cases, they even reshot scenes with other cast members to reduce the troubled actor's screen time without making it obvious to viewers. It was damage control at its most cynical. Years later, when cast members finally opened up about this period, They described it as one of the most difficult times of their careers. They felt helpless. They cared about this person, but they didn't know how to help. The culture of the time didn't provide resources or support systems. You just pushed through. You did your job. You pretended everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. And the strain of keeping this secret, of watching someone spiral while being unable to do anything meaningful to help, took an emotional toll on everyone involved. The actor eventually sought treatment, but not until years after the show ended. By then, a lot of damage had been done. Not just to this person's health and career, but to the entire production environment. The cast had learned that the network and producers would protect their bottom line before protecting the people who made the show possible. They had learned that in Hollywood, your value was measured in ratings and revenue, not in your humanity. That lesson would inform every decision they made going forward. And it would shape how they felt about the show even as audiences loved it. The addiction crisis was just one symptom of a much larger problem festering behind the scenes. When Lost in Space debuted in 1965, it was positioned as serious science fiction. The marketing emphasized danger, survival, and the unknown. The show had tension. It had real stakes. Families could get hurt. The robot could malfunction. Alien creatures posed genuine threats. Audiences tuned in because they wanted to see how the Robinson family would overcome impossible odds. But as the show gained popularity, something shifted. The network executives started paying attention to the demographic breakdown of viewers. And they noticed something unexpected. Children were watching in huge numbers. This discovery changed everything. Network executives saw dollar signs. If children were watching, then toys could be sold. Action figures, model spaceships, lunch boxes, board games. The merchandising potential was enormous. But there was a catch. Toy manufacturers didn't want their products associated with a show that was too dark or too violent. Parents didn't want to buy toys that reminded them of scary moments from the television program. So the network made a decision. They called a meeting with the producers and gave them clear instructions. Make the show lighter. Make it funnier. Make it more family-friendly. In other words, make it safer for selling toys. The cast felt this pressure immediately. Scripts started changing. Comedy scenes were being added where dramatic moments used to be. The robot, who had been a mysterious and sometimes threatening presence in early episodes, became increasingly endearing and comedic. Don West's romantic storylines were softened. Even the alien encounters started leaning more toward adventure and wonder rather than genuine danger and fear. The producers fought against some of these changes, but not hard enough. The network held the purse strings. If you wanted your show to keep existing, you did what the network asked. What made this transition particularly painful for the cast was that they had signed on to make one kind of show, and now they were being asked to make a completely different one. Actors like Bill Mumy, who played young Will Robinson, had developed their characters with certain emotional depths and complexities. But suddenly, those depths were being stripped away in favor of broader, more cartoonish moments. The scripts were becoming less intelligent. The dialogue was becoming more simplistic. And the cast knew it. They could feel the quality declining even as the ratings stayed strong. By the third season, the transformation was complete. The show had become almost a parody of what it started as. Episodes that would have been thrilling in season 1 were now played for laughs. The robot was cracking jokes. Will and Penny were having goofy adventures. The dangers felt less real because they were being undercut by comedy. Some cast members embraced this shift. Others resented it deeply. But nobody had a choice. The network had spoken. The show would continue on these terms or it would end. What the cast revealed, years later, was that this shift in tone wasn't just a creative decision. It was a betrayal of the original vision. The producers had promised them they were making serious science fiction. They had pitched it as a show with substance and depth. But once the money started flowing, once the merchandise started selling, those promises evaporated. The cast felt used. They felt like they had been tricked into participating in something that became increasingly hollow and commercial as time went on. Some actors left because of this. Others stayed but became cynical about the entire enterprise. The irony is that the network strategy worked perfectly from a business standpoint. The show was more popular than ever. Merchandise was flying off shelves. But from an artistic standpoint, something irreplaceable had been lost. The cast knew it. The producers knew it. And deep down, the network probably knew it too. But nobody said anything because in Hollywood, success silences criticism. But the network pressure wasn't the only force tearing the cast apart. Behind the scenes of Lost in Space, there was a romantic entanglement that created tension between cast members and made the work environment incredibly awkward. For years, this was one of the best-kept secrets in Hollywood. It involved 3 cast members, and it played out in real time as cameras rolled and producers pretended not to notice. The situation was so delicate, so fraught with potential scandal, that everyone involved made an unspoken agreement to keep it completely silent. But decades later, when the cast finally opened up in interviews and memoirs, the full story emerged. The core of the triangle involved 2 actors from the main cast and a crew member who became increasingly present on set. One of the actors developed romantic feelings for someone they shouldn't have. Another actor noticed and felt hurt or betrayed. Meanwhile, the object of affection was caught in the middle, trying to navigate an impossible situation while maintaining professionalism on a live television production. Every day on set became charged with unspoken tension. Glances lingered a moment too long. Conversations were strained. Inside jokes that used to feel natural now felt loaded with subtext. What made this situation particularly damaging was that the cast had to portray a loving, functional family on screen while harboring these real feelings off-screen. They had to hug each other for scenes. They had to deliver romantic dialogue convincingly. They had to pretend that everything was fine when everything was decidedly not fine. The emotional whiplash was intense. Some actors became withdrawn. Others became overly cheerful, using humor as a shield. The director started noticing that certain scenes felt less authentic than they used to. There was a flatness, a lack of genuine connection between cast members in moments where connection was essential. The network and producers were aware of what was happening, but they didn't intervene. Why would they? As long as production kept moving forward and the show kept ratings, personal drama was irrelevant. In fact, some executives might have believed that the tension between cast members would actually make their on-screen chemistry more compelling. They didn't care about the emotional toll this was taking on real human beings. They cared about the product. The machine just kept grinding forward. What the cast eventually revealed was that this love triangle created lasting damage to their friendships. Some actors who had been close before the show became distant afterward. Others never really recovered from the hurt and disappointment of that period. One actor described it as a betrayal that they never fully forgave. Another talked about how the situation made them question who they could trust in this industry. The experience hardened them. It made them more cynical. It taught them that Hollywood was a place where personal integrity often took a back seat to professional necessity. The worst part was that nobody could talk about it openly at the time. If word had gotten out to the press, it would have become a scandal. The studio would have protected itself by throwing one of the actors under the bus. Careers could have been destroyed. So everyone stayed silent. They compartmentalized. They showed up to work, did their jobs, and carried the emotional weight of this situation alone. It was a microcosm of how Hollywood operated in the 1960s, a system that prioritized image and profit over the well-being of the people who made the entertainment possible. The romantic tension was just one symptom of a deeper fracturing happening within the cast. And by the 3rd season, those fractures were about to become impossible to ignore. When the 3rd season of Lost in Space premiered in 1968, longtime viewers immediately sensed something was off. The episodes felt lighter, weirder, more absurd. Guest stars appeared more frequently. The tone had shifted from dramatic science fiction to campy adventure. Some fans loved it. They thought it was fun and entertaining, but others felt disappointed. They missed the grounded storytelling of the earlier seasons. What they didn't know was that this shift wasn't just a creative choice. It was a symptom of everything falling apart behind the scenes. By the time production began on season 3, the cast was exhausted. The show had been on the air for 3 years. That's a grueling schedule in television, especially in the 1960s. There were no streaming platforms, no syndication deals that would guarantee future revenue. Every episode had to perform in the ratings immediately or the show was done. The pressure was relentless. The cast had spent 3 years pushing themselves to deliver consistent, quality performances under demanding conditions. And now they were being asked to do it again. Some of them didn't have anything left to give. Mark Goddard's reduced involvement meant that the dynamic of the main cast had fundamentally changed. Don West, who had been the action hero and romantic lead, was now sidelined. This forced the producers to restructure storylines and shift focus to other characters. Some episodes barely featured Don at all. It created an odd imbalance that viewers could feel even if they couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. The Robinson family unit felt less cohesive without the outside perspective that Goddard had provided. The producers, sensing that the show needed something to revitalize it, started taking more risks. They brought in more elaborate guest stars. They introduced stranger concepts. They leaned harder into the robot's comedy potential. They made the threats less threatening and the adventures more whimsical. Some of these decisions worked brilliantly. Certain third-season episodes became fan favorites, but others fell flat. The tonal inconsistency became a defining characteristic of the season. Some episodes felt like they were from a completely different show. What the cast revealed, looking back, was that the third season felt like they were just going through the motions. The enthusiasm that had driven the first 2 seasons was gone. People were tired. People were frustrated. The romantic tensions that had been simmering throughout production were now at their worst. The addiction issues that had been managed quietly were continuing to cause problems. And nobody had the emotional reserves left to really invest in making great television. They showed up. They said their lines. They collected their paychecks. But the magic was fading. One cast member described the third season as the moment when they realized this job was no longer fulfilling. It had become work. Hard, exhausting, meaningless work. Another talked about how they could see the quality declining and felt powerless to stop it. A third revealed that they had already started planning their exit strategy by the middle of the season. They were done. They wanted out. And they weren't alone in that feeling. The irony is that the third season, for all its problems, was still popular with audiences. The ratings remained strong. The network was happy. Toy sales continued to climb. From a business perspective, the show was thriving. But from an artistic and human perspective, it was dying. The cast was burning out. The producers were running out of ideas. And the original vision that had made the show special was becoming harder and harder to see beneath the layers of commercialism and compromise. What nobody anticipated was that one more shock was about to hit that would change the course of the entire series. There was one cast member on Lost in Space who made a decision that shocked Hollywood. After the show ended, this actor essentially disappeared from public life. They turned down major film roles. They rejected lucrative television offers. They walked away from the celebrity that Lost in Space had given them. Most actors would consider this insane. You have a hit show. You have name recognition. You have opportunities falling into your lap. Why would anyone walk away from that? But this actor had reasons. Reasons that the cast eventually revealed to the public decades later. The actor in question had joined Lost in Space as a young person. The experience of sudden fame, of being recognized everywhere, of having your private life become public property. It was overwhelming. Imagine being a teenager or young adult and suddenly everyone knows your face. Strangers approach you on the street. Photographers follow you. Your relationships are speculated about in gossip columns. Your every mistake is documented and discussed. For someone unprepared for that level of scrutiny, it can be psychologically devastating. This actor found themselves struggling with anxiety and depression. They felt trapped by their own fame. What made it worse was that the cast had endured 3 years of a grueling production schedule with all the drama and tension we've already discussed. By the time the show ended, this young actor was emotionally exhausted. They had given years of their life to this project. They had sacrificed their privacy and their normal teenage or young adult experiences. And for what? So that executives could make money off their image? So that they could be recognized and pursued everywhere they went. The actor made a conscious choice. They were done with Hollywood. They were done with acting. They were going to step away and reclaim their life. The network tried to convince them otherwise. They offered money. They offered roles in movies and television pilots. They promised they could control the narrative, manage their image, make them a star. But the actor refused. They were resolute. They wanted anonymity more than they wanted fame. They wanted privacy more than they wanted money. They wanted to be a normal person living a normal life, without cameras following them and strangers asking for autographs. So they left. They disappeared from the public eye almost completely. For years, fans speculated about what had happened to this actor. Had they died? Had they been blacklisted? Had they just given up on their career? The truth was simpler and sadder. They had realized that the cost of fame wasn't worth the price. They had experienced the dark side of celebrity and decided it wasn't for them. They chose mental health and privacy over money and recognition. In retrospect, it was a remarkably mature and self-aware decision for someone so young. The studio's deception was about to become irrelevant for a very different reason. There was a specific moment during the third season when the entire cast came extremely close to walking off the set and never coming back. It was a day that could have ended Lost in Space right there and then. No final episodes. No proper conclusion. Just a sudden, dramatic implosion that would have shocked the industry and potentially ruined careers. The cast has never discussed this incident in great detail publicly, but decades later, some of them opened up about what happened and why they decided to stay despite their anger and frustration. The incident involved a decision by the producers that felt like a final insult to the cast's intelligence and professionalism. A script had been delivered that was so bad, so fundamentally broken, so embarrassingly stupid, that the actors couldn't believe they were being asked to perform it. The plot made no logical sense. The dialogue was cringeworthy. The character moments were inconsistent with everything that had been established. One actor, reading through the script the night before shooting, actually laughed out loud in disbelief. They couldn't imagine delivering these lines with a straight face. They called other cast members. Everyone agreed. This was unacceptable. The next morning, before filming began, the cast had an informal meeting. They discussed the possibility of refusing to shoot the episode. They talked about walking out collectively and sending a message to the producers and network that they had standards and wouldn't compromise them anymore. There was real anger in that conversation. Real frustration. Real exhaustion. They had endured 3 years of increasing mediocrity, and this script represented the breaking point. One actor was prepared to make an official statement to the producers that morning. Another was ready to contact their agent and start looking for a way out of their contract. But then something happened that nobody expected. One of the older, more experienced cast members spoke up. This person had been in the industry for years before Lost in Space. They had perspective that the younger actors lacked. They talked about the consequences of walking off a production. They explained that in Hollywood, actors who quit shows are labeled as difficult, unreliable, unprofessional. Those labels follow you forever. Future producers don't want to hire actors who have a reputation for causing problems. The career damage could be permanent and irreversible. They talked about the young actors in the cast whose entire careers were ahead of them. Was it worth destroying those futures over one bad script? The conversation shifted. The anger was still there, but it was tempered by reality. The actors realized they were trapped. They couldn't leave without destroying themselves professionally. They couldn't stay without compromising their integrity. So what could they do? They decided on a compromise. They would shoot the episode, but they would give it their absolute best effort. They would use their skills as actors to elevate the material as much as possible. They would try to inject authenticity and emotion into scenes that had no business asking for those things. They would do their jobs professionally, even though they resented the circumstances. It was a mature decision, but it was also heartbreaking. The cast realized in that moment that they had no real power. Despite their fame, despite their popularity with audiences, despite their integral role in making the show work, they were ultimately disposable. The network could feed them garbage scripts and they would have to perform them. The producers could ignore their concerns and they would have to smile and pretend everything was fine. The system was designed to extract maximum value from them while giving them minimum consideration. And there was nothing they could do about it. What made this realization particularly painful was that it sank in for each actor individually that they needed to start planning their escape routes. One actor began taking meetings for other projects. Another started thinking seriously about retiring from acting altogether. A third made connections with people outside the entertainment industry, exploring alternative careers. None of them announced their intentions. They just quietly started preparing for life after Lost in Space. Because they all knew, on some level, that this couldn't continue much longer. The show was approaching its end, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. The episode that had caused such turmoil actually turned out reasonably well when it aired. The cast's professionalism had salvaged it. Audiences didn't notice anything amiss. Ratings remained stable. But the cost of that performance, the emotional toll of being forced to compromise yet again, had pushed the cast to their limit. They had one more season left in them, maybe. Beyond that, all bets were off. But before the show could end naturally, something happened that forced the issue and exposed a truth that changed everything about how the cast viewed what they had been part of. One of the cast members on Lost in Space became deeply invested in method acting during the show's run. For those unfamiliar with the technique, method acting is when a performer tries to actually experience the emotions and circumstances of their character in order to bring authentic feeling to their performance. It's a legitimate acting technique used by many brilliant performers. But it can also be psychologically dangerous if taken to extremes. And on the set of Lost in Space, one actor took it too far. This performer decided that to truly understand their character's isolation and fear on an alien planet, they needed to actually experience isolation and fear. So they started staying in character even when cameras weren't rolling. They would remain emotionally distant from other cast members between takes. They would isolate themselves during breaks. They would sleep minimally, trying to induce genuine exhaustion and desperation. They refused to eat certain foods, trying to feel the physical deprivation their character might experience. The producers noticed but didn't intervene. Some of them actually thought it was impressive. They saw it as a sign of serious commitment to the craft. But what was actually happening was that this actor was engaging in harmful behavior that was damaging their physical and mental health. The sleep deprivation was causing cognitive problems. They were becoming forgetful and distracted. The restricted diet was leading to nutritional deficiencies. They were losing weight rapidly. Their energy levels were plummeting. Other cast members started to worry. They could see that something was wrong. But when they tried to reach out, the actor would dismiss their concerns. They were committed to their craft. They weren't going to break character just because people were worried. The situation escalated when the actor started having what appeared to be panic attacks on set. They would become overwhelmed by emotion in moments that didn't necessarily call for it. They would have difficulty remembering lines because their mind was so scattered. There were days when they could barely function. The director had to keep shooting around them, working with other cast members and coming back to this person's scenes when they seemed more stable. It was an inefficient, frustrating process. But nobody was willing to actually address the root cause. The actor was harming themselves in the name of art. Eventually, a concerned cast member reached out to a family member of the troubled actor and explained the situation. The family member came to set and was shocked by what they saw. This person was clearly suffering. Their behavior was erratic. Their physical condition was noticeably deteriorated. The family member insisted that the actor see a doctor immediately. When the doctor examined them, they were alarmed. The actor's vital signs were concerning. Their nutritional status was poor. Their mental state showed signs of depression and anxiety. The doctor recommended that they stop whatever they were doing immediately and seek professional help. The actor eventually agreed to stop the extreme method acting techniques. But the damage had been done. They spent the remainder of the production dealing with the physical and psychological aftereffects. They struggled with anxiety and depression for years after the show ended. Looking back, this actor would later describe it as one of the darkest periods of their life. They had sacrificed their health and well-being in pursuit of artistic authenticity. And what had it gotten them? A slightly better performance? Maybe. But was it worth the damage? Absolutely not. What the cast revealed about this situation was their collective guilt for not intervening sooner. They recognized that they had all stood by and watched someone self-destruct without doing enough to stop it. They told themselves it wasn't their place. They told themselves the actor was a grown-up who could make their own decisions. They told themselves they didn't want to interfere. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. They were too exhausted, too focused on their own survival, too trapped in the system to really help. The actor's suffering happened in plain sight, and everyone just accepted it as part of the price of making television. This incident became a turning point for several cast members. They realized that the culture of the show, the pressure of the production, the lack of genuine care for people's well-being, all of it had created an environment where someone could hurt themselves and nobody would actually stop them. It was a wake-up call. It made them question whether this was how things had to be. And it made them more determined to get out before they suffered similar damage. The actor eventually recovered, but it took years. They never achieved the level of success in their career that they might have otherwise. The experience on Lost in Space had marked them. And while the cast felt terrible about what had happened, they also recognized it as a symptom of a much larger problem with how entertainment was produced and how little value was placed on the human cost of that production. What nobody anticipated was that the final season would bring one more shocking revelation that would change how everyone understood what had really been happening all along. During the production of the third season's final episodes, one of the producers made a confession that shocked the cast. This person had been involved in the show since the beginning. They had witnessed everything. They had made many of the decisions that had caused so much pain and frustration. And now, as the end was approaching, they seemed to want to unburden themselves. They pulled aside several cast members and told them something that put the entire experience into a completely different context. The producer revealed that the network had planned to cancel the show after the second season. That was the original plan. The ratings were good, but the network executives had decided that 3 seasons was the natural endpoint for the series. They wanted to end it while it was still popular before it declined. But then something unexpected happened. The toy sales exceeded everyone's expectations. Merchandise was flying off shelves. Parents were buying Lost in Space products at unprecedented rates. Suddenly, the network saw an opportunity to extend the show and capitalize on that merchandise revenue for one more year. So they ordered a third season. But here's the part that troubled the cast. The network didn't actually believe in the show anymore. They didn't care about the storytelling or the character development or the quality of the production. They just cared about extending the merchandise cycle. That's why the scripts became lighter and more comedic. That's why the tone shifted toward camp and absurdity. That's why storylines became increasingly ridiculous. The network was deliberately making the show less serious because they believed that lighter, sillier content would appeal more to children and drive toy sales even higher. The producer also revealed that several creative decisions the cast had objected to, decisions that had felt arbitrary and frustrating, were actually mandated by the merchandise companies. Toy manufacturers had specific requests about how characters should be portrayed. They wanted the robot to be funnier because funny robots sell more toys. They wanted Will Robinson to have more adventures because adventurous kids' characters drive action figure sales. They wanted less serious drama because drama doesn't translate well into toy lines. The show had essentially been hijacked by the toy industry. It wasn't a television program anymore. It was a half-hour commercial for merchandise. This confession was devastating to hear. The cast realized that everything they had sacrificed, everything they had endured, was ultimately in service of selling toys. The long hours, the emotional toll, the compromises to quality, the toxic working environment. All of it was so that some corporation could maximize profit from a merchandise line. The show itself had become secondary. It was just a vehicle for selling products to children. And the cast, who had poured their hearts and souls into their performances, were just tools in that sales machine. One cast member later described hearing this confession as the moment they fully understood the cynicism of the entertainment industry. They had suspected it before, but hearing it confirmed was different. It was like a final betrayal. They had told themselves that they were making art. They had told themselves that the show had value and meaning. But the truth was that they had been participating in the most cynical form of commercial manipulation. They were selling toys to children by providing programming that parents would allow their children to watch. What made this revelation even more troubling was that it explained so many of the strange decisions and frustrations they had experienced. The arbitrary script changes, the sudden shifts in tone, the insistence on certain character moments, the focus on visual spectacle over storytelling. It all made sense now. It wasn't creative. It was commercial. And the network had known all along that this was what the third season would be. They had deliberately deceived the cast into thinking they were making television. They were actually making advertising. The cast also realized that this revelation had probably come from the producer out of guilt. This person had been complicit in the deception. They had gone along with the network's demands. They had not fought hard enough to protect the creative integrity of the show or the well-being of the cast. And now, as the show was ending, they seemed to want forgiveness or at least acknowledgement that they had tried to do right by the show and the people who made it. Some cast members accepted this confession with grace. Others felt it was too little, too late. Looking back decades later, the cast discussed this moment as the one that finally made sense of everything. It was the context they had been missing. It explained the chaos and the compromises and the quality decline. It explained why the producers hadn't fought harder against the network. It explained why safety concerns and worker well-being had been so easily dismissed. Because from the network's perspective, none of that mattered. The show was just merchandise delivery. The cast were just performers in a commercial. And once you understood that, everything else fell into place. But understanding the machinery that had exploited them didn't make the damage any less real. It just clarified what they had been part of and why it had felt so wrong from beginning to end. After Lost in Space ended in 1968, the cast scattered. Some pursued other acting roles. Some tried to move into directing or producing. Others left the entertainment industry entirely. But what's remarkable is how quiet they were about their experiences on the show. For decades, there were almost no tell-all interviews. No bitter memoirs exposing what had really happened behind the scenes. No public complaints to the press. The cast simply moved on and kept their struggles private. But why? What kept them silent for so long? Part of it was fear. Hollywood operates on reputation and relationships. If you spoke out against a major network or production company, you risked being labeled as difficult or ungrateful. Future producers wouldn't want to work with you. You could be blacklisted. Your career could be over before you knew what happened. The threat was real and well known. So most cast members made the calculation that staying silent was safer than speaking out. They had experienced enough pain and disappointment. They didn't want to add career destruction on top of it. Another part was shame. Several cast members felt ashamed that they had compromised their values and accepted situations they knew were wrong. They had stayed silent when they should have spoken up. They had participated in creating increasingly mediocre television when they could have refused. They had allowed themselves to be used by a system that didn't care about them. Looking back, that felt like a failure on their part. So instead of talking about what the network had done to them, they internalized the blame. They told themselves they should have fought harder. They should have walked away sooner. They should have stood up for themselves. The shame kept them quiet. A third factor was simple exhaustion and the desire to move on. Talking about trauma requires reliving it. It requires opening old wounds and processing pain that you've spent years trying to forget or compartmentalize. Most of the cast just wanted to put Lost in Space behind them and move forward with their lives. They didn't want to spend years being defined by the show or by their experiences making it. They wanted to be seen as more than just the people who had suffered on the set of a 1960s television program. But as decades passed, something shifted. The cast aged. They became more secure in their later careers and personal lives. The threats that had kept them silent seemed less relevant. Some of them developed health issues or faced their own mortality, which prompted reflection on their legacies and what they wanted to be remembered for. And they realized that staying silent meant that the true story of Lost in Space would never be told. Future generations would only know the public version, the fun, successful show with great ratings and beloved characters. They would never know about the suffering, the compromises, the exploitation, the damage. So the cast began to open up. Carefully at first, in interviews with entertainment journalists and historians. Then more openly, in memoirs and documentary appearances. They told their stories. They revealed what had really happened behind the scenes. Some of their revelations shocked longtime fans. Others confirmed suspicions that viewers had harbored for years. But all of it added up to a picture of a show that had been much darker and more troubled than anyone had realized. What's remarkable is that the cast didn't do this out of bitterness or a desire for revenge. They did it because they believed the truth mattered. They believed that future generations of young performers should understand what they were getting into. They believed that the public should know what it really takes to make entertainment. They believed that the human cost of television production shouldn't be hidden. And they believed that their experiences, painful as they were, could serve a purpose if they were honest about them. One actor described the decision to speak out as liberating. For decades, they had carried these secrets. They had felt like they couldn't tell anyone what had really happened. Once they finally started talking about it, they felt lighter. The shame began to lift. They realized that they weren't responsible for the system's failures. They had just been young people trying to do their jobs in an exploitative environment. That distinction made all the difference. Another cast member revealed that speaking out had helped them process trauma they didn't even know they were carrying. They had suppressed so much emotion over the years that they didn't realize how deeply the experience had affected them until they started talking about it. By finally telling their story, they were able to heal in ways they couldn't have otherwise. The legacy of Lost in Space is complicated now. The show itself remains beloved by fans and is recognized as a classic of 1960s science fiction television. The performances are still praised. The robot is still iconic. But the story behind the scenes is a cautionary tale about how entertainment is made, how much is asked of performers, and how little value is sometimes placed on their well-being. The cast's willingness to finally speak truthfully about their experiences has transformed Lost in Space from just a television show into a window into the real human cost of making entertainment. They didn't stay silent forever. And in the end, their honesty has become their greatest legacy from the show. More important than any performance or memorable episode. They told the truth, and the truth set them free. After everything the cast went through to make Lost in Space, what do you think? Should they have walked away sooner? Or was it worth it to create something that so many people loved? And do you think the network treated them fairly? Or was the exploitation unforgivable? Let me know in the comments what you think happened behind the scenes, and whether you'll ever watch the show the same way again.